about the Middle Ages, and one of them is what it's like to be Gothic in architecture. And if I asked you to be Gothic, I bet you could be immediately. Make a Gothic sound for me. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. It's just one of the things we know, and it's perfectly true. Unlike some of the things that we think we know, this is really that's what Gothic does. It points straight up, as straight as it can. And then there's another thing that most people know. I think maybe even more people know. They know the word Notre Dame. They may pronounce it Notre Dame, but they know that those two words. And many people would say Notre Dame of Paris immediately, maybe because they know about the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Notre Dame. So that's also an important thing to know about the Gothic period, because Our Lady, Notre Dame, was the absolute queen of the Gothic period. She was on top. She was the thing that was most conspicuous, most thought about. People say they think of Notre Dame of Paris. Almost every cathedral in France in the late 12th and 13th century was dedicated to the Virgin. It was so universal that you have to say Notre Dame of Paris or Notre Dame of Chartres because they're all Notre Dame. The dedication was to her. Now those two things, as I say, really could be maybe unraveled to give you a complete knowledge of the Gothic period. But there is something about it that's very, very difficult for us to understand, and really very far from us. And I think that's the fact that in the 12th and 13th century, and it really goes from the middle of the 12th century to just past the middle of the 13th century, about 125 years. The thing which is so astounding to us is that this was a totally coherent society. Now we live in a society that's almost totally incoherent. And this, what we look at then is a totally coherent society. And it is as if Rome had been resurrected, only Rome had really risen from the dead and become a spiritual thing. Because it had that urge toward universality, it had that urge and the capacity to involve great numbers of people in the same organization, the same system of thought and the system of action. There was, of course, one language, Latin. Now, people spoke other languages, but they could all really communicate, and all literate people or educated people knew Latin, spoken Latin. So it was that thing that people ever since then have been wishing for, and I think even before then wished for, a language which would be universally understood. So that you could go from one place, from Italy to Germany, and you could speak to all the people who were as educated as you. And the same thing would be true, you could go from England to Italy, and it would still, you would have that. Now, not only would you have a language, but you would have a kind of expectation of the way things are going to happen, are going to be conducted. It was a universal, really, system of action, of belief, not just of theology, but of belief about the relations of people. So that it was very common, for instance, to send off to another town or another castle, or in a totally different country, very young children, your own very young children. Because you knew that the experience that they would have, if you were German and you sent them to England, or if you were Italian, you sent them to France, you knew that the experience that they would have would be the same experience that they would have at home. You see, that there was that kind of expectation of a familiar, ordered world in which you comprehended what was going on. It was all shared and clear. And of course, the basis of it was, one of the great bases was the Catholic Church, which was sufficiently by this time really in command. There wasn't any other church. There wasn't any other possibility of another church. So if you didn't belong to the Catholic Church, you sort of did anyway. I mean, you could hardly avoid it, unless you had some very special outside reason. But for most people, it was a part of life. It was like water to fishes. I mean, it was simply what happened and what was going on and what you were a part of. There wasn't any kind of sort of choice or any speculation or doubt. And if there wasn't really in a way any answer to it. So it was an extraordinary kind of period. And there was also, of course, the idea of how war should be conducted under chivalry, how all kinds of relationships of people should be conducted, because the society was a very strict hierarchy. There was the large base of people who were workers on the land and who were workers in villages, forges, and weavers and that kind of artisan group. And then above that were the nobility, the minor nobility. Above that were kings. And at the very top of the society was the Pope. And the Pope stood exactly as if he were on a real pyramid and therefore was closer to heaven. So he was in very close connection. But it was what looked like an absolutely unshakable and marvelously solid thing because of the pyramidal shape of it. And everyone knew exactly where he belonged. Everyone had an exact place which he knew. And furthermore, everybody else knew where he belonged. And it wasn't until late in the 13th century that you had any way of escaping it. Then if you could escape to a town and live there for a year and a day, you were free. You became a townsman, and you were outside of the hierarchy that you'd been in before. So it had a kind of comfort to it. See, it didn't do any good, for instance, to work hard, because you weren't going to advance, because you were where you were. And it didn't do any good to be a particularly virtuous, from the point of view of society, duke or prince or prelate of the church, because you were going to be that thing. And people accepted you as a duke, and they would say, well, he was good Duke John, and he was bad Duke Jim, and he was the bald, and he was the brave, and he was the cowardly. All kinds of things in addition to that, but it didn't affect anything. It didn't affect her being just a Duke so-and-so. So it had a marvelously soothing quality for the spirits of the world, just to remove the possibility of any very severe, rapid advance in the world. Work was thought of as the curse on Adam. And anybody who could get out of work and who was in any way enabled not to have to work was thought of as absolutely lucky beyond anything. And obviously very much in God's favor. Or you'd be working otherwise, because that was the curse that fell on Adam when he chose the knowledge of good and evil. So there was a great flowering in this period of celebrations and feast days, and times when people would get together and eat a great deal and drink a great deal and make a procession, because there were endless parades and processions all the time. And in fact, that was one of the things that we have almost no knowledge of. The extreme character, the extreme violence of the nature of life, just living a life, was in terms of violent contrast. I think we, as people living in the 20th century, anywhere we live, can hardly ever be in total darkness. It's almost impossible. Even now in the country, the lights from towns and cities keep a kind of faint twilight. And we know almost nothing of absolute silence. And we know nothing of the kind of cold that they knew. And with that, you see, great heat. So that they sat in front of, and as near as they could actually in fireplaces, and roasted themselves. Because it was so cold otherwise, you see, but the contrast is the most dramatic thing. And the contrast of daylight, when there were just processions and people, street cries. How many of you have ever heard a street cry? How many? Yeah. See, but it's very rare. It's very rare. Even when I was little, there used to be street cries. People selling, buying old clothes and old bottles and things, and selling fruits and vegetables. But, and in places like in the South, they had real songs that they sang. That is, they always used the same song. Well, this was, in the Middle Ages, everybody that had anything to sell was singing a song about it. So it was a continuous din. And then with people going by, whenever the Lord or any person of any kind of power or wealth went out anywhere, it was a production. He had people playing musical instruments before him. As he went out, he scattered gold around, because charity was one of the greatest virtues that anybody could have. And the poor expected it. They sat outside of whatever place where a wealthy person lived. They were not just nobles. They were also burghers who were wealthy in that way. And then the Lord himself wore, and everybody that accompanied him wore the costume that meant he was this person. And they wore the costume that meant that they were related in this way to him. So that everybody that you saw was ticketed in this way. You could tell who they were. And they could be assured of who they were. I mean, it was our puzzlement, about who we are in the 20th century, which is something that affects everybody in the 20th century. It had absolutely no meaning, because they knew who they were, and they wore who they were, and they walked with who they were, and the whole divisions of society. You would see beggars, and it was a very stirring business to be a beggar because of the emphasis on charity, and people mutilated themselves and made all kinds of disguises, of course, to be beggars. And from the beggar, you see, would be the prince or the duke or the bishop as far removed in terms of what he wore, in terms of his walking, in terms of the whole procession, as anything would possibly be. But this kind of contrast. And then the streets were full of pigs and filth. And if an animal died, and there wasn't much you could do with him, he simply lay on the street and rotted. And there was a terrible smell almost throughout the whole Middle Ages, which made us put a lot of money in perfume. And that was, of course, quite expensive. They could make their own, but they wanted and did send to the east. They sent to Constantinople. But the quality of emotion was also much more open, much more obvious. People went into terrible tempers and did terrible things. And then they would spend the next 3 months on their knees in penance. And they would always cry, and there was the men and women cried and fell on each other's shoulders, and kissed each other. The whole emotional life was so much more heated than we can even imagine. It's just impossible for us to think of it. And there was also a marvelous capacity to believe anything that was told. There was almost no skepticism. If you said, I went to Italy and I saw people who had enormous big feet, and they were so big they could live in them like a house. They would lie down on their backs and then they'd put their feet up and they'd have a house. Everybody said, isn't that interesting? What else did you see? There was no way in which you'd say, I can't quite believe that. It was such credulity. There was an expectation of miracle, an expectation of things being mysterious and difficult to understand or impossible to explain. And there were also the great entertainments of things like executions, that everybody was enormously entertained by them. Why? Because they thought that if you had done something like murdered somebody or stolen something, that was wrong and you should be punished. And there was no question about it. You see, there was no shifting that blame. So one of their biggest entertainments was the executions. And the people who were being executed were being judged exactly as if they were in a play. People would say, he made an excellent, very interesting. You see how the people were crying, and he kissed you had to kiss the executioner to show that you forgave him. And then some of them would add to this, you see, by kneeling and kissing their hands, and then making great speeches from the scaffold, saying, I was terrible and I'm sorry and I certainly deserve to be hanged and quartered, because they had wonderfully complicated. They didn't finish with just killing somebody. They hang them afterwards, and they split them open and cut them into fours and put each part in another, nailed on a wall somewhere, so that they would punish the corpse as most severely as they possibly could. But then, of course, everybody was walking right around and saw it. They'd be on the walls of the city. And the people, sometimes the punishment was that they'd have to hang until they were rotten and would fall off of the gallows. Well, you see, that does a lot for the other people walking around and decided, and much more, I think, not anything to particularly make them be good, just make them be sick of the stomach. That's the same thing. So that this quality, this kind of exaggerated or heightened quality of life, is one of the most extraordinary things about the Middle Ages. The more you read about it, you see how people betray each other, and then they're overcome by grief, and they're overcome by their sorrow of their own wickedness, and they have a violent shift in emotions from one thing to another. And when they went to church, they felt that actually they didn't have to do anything but appear, but go. And so they conducted all kinds of businesses and trade, and met all their friends. It was a big social occasion, and many people never took communion at all. They just didn't at all. They went to the Mass, they watched it, and that was all. But there was continually going on in the cathedral. It was a very, it's such a heightened and strange kind of world. And it comes into existence, that's what the slide. It comes into existence after what was of course, the fall of Rome, and what's always called the Dark Ages. And it's a pretty good word for it, because it was one of the most unpleasant times that people ever could have lived in. That period between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Gothic era. it was a time when people absolutely could not plan anything. Their lives were utterly unsettled. There were only two places in the world where there was any kind of learning or knowledge or safety. And one of them was Ireland, and one of them was Constantinople, Byzantium. But it was the rest of the world had to live under continuous threat of death, of disaster, of having everything which they had being taken away from them, of endless illnesses. It was a period when the effort to recreate a society that had some kind of stability was constantly being destroyed. Some of you may remember that Constantine tried to recreate the classical world at the beginning of the 9th century, year 800. And he imported people from Ireland. He tried to make literacy general. He made schools. He did all kinds of things. But his heirs immediately destroyed the whole thing. And in the 10th century, in the 900s, there was again a tremendous invasion from all of the Vikings, all of the Norsemen. And they simply did nothing but burn and destroy, and everything fell into ruin. And there were not many people left, and there was not much, there was almost no agriculture of any kind, and there was no money, actual physical money. Everything had to be done by barter. And in that world, which was truly a dark world, is mysteriously and marvelously bright. One of the things which is conspicuous is that in the 900s, everybody lived in fear of the year 1000. They thought that was the Christ was coming back in the year 1000. And that was why they called it the millennium, and that was why we use that word to say that'll happen in the millennium. But it was a fear. They felt that the year 1000 was just as much as you could expect. That was just, and then the world would be wiped away. Well, everybody wrote who wrote anything in the 900s, in the 10th century, wrote, "It is the end of the world." And that continues through the year 1000. And for the very same reason that you can easily understand, which is that they couldn't decide whether the 1,000 years was up with the year 1000 or whether it had to go to 1099. So they were continually, until at least 1060, when they began to formulate themselves. And of course, as you know, the Norman Conqueror went to England. There was a gathering of strength in the second half of the 11th century. And by the end of it, people thought, we're free, we're home free. It's not going to happen now. It won't happen until 1500. They had some sense of it taking 500 years or 1,000 years, whichever. So there was a great burst of optimism and joy, and actually a new world began to be created. One of the things that happens, as you know, in about 1095, I think, or 96, is the First Crusades. See, by that time, they thought, we're going to live, it's up to us to bring Jerusalem back into the hands of Christians. We'll go on a crusade. And they went, of course, just with exactly the same kind of credulity, with exactly the same kind of passion, and the same kind of really thoughtlessness, as we would say. And they ended disastrously. All of the crusades ended really disastrously. And they started out, of course, with great numbers of people who had nothing to eat. They had to rob everybody along the way. Then the Second Crusade, everybody said, look at them, they're coming again. And locked everything up, and did everything they could to have nothing to do with them. And by the Third Crusade, they were actually, they said, why bother to go clear to Jerusalem, you know? So it was a disastrous thing. But of course, absolutely, visually marvelous. She with all these mounted knights and all of their banners and all of their people playing musical instruments and all of the campfires. The whole thing was a tremendous dramatic presentation. But it was, of course, perfectly, nothing came of it. But it was part of that kind of joyousness, part of that really youthful, and you know there was a crusade just of the children, that ended in their all being sold into slavery. But the sense of stirring of life and a new world being created begins really in the 12th century. And it's a century of just extraordinary people, just amazing people. I'm sure some of them you know about, Richard Coeur de Lion. I think everybody knows Richard Coeur de Lion by the name, if nothing else. It's Richard de Lionheart. Because it's such a wonderful name, it can't be forgotten just by the name itself. And then there were all kinds of people of kind of stature, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who married the King of France and divorced him and married the King of England. And that's a very willful and, active way to do. Everybody, all the priests and all the church and everything disapproved her, but nobody else did. And least of all, then she had all these sons, I think 4 sons, all kings. Richard Coeur de Lion was one of them. And lived to be 80 years old. Always an absolute dynamo in everybody's hair and getting on everybody's nerves, but being so extraordinary. And you could go on forever with the people. Héloïse and Abelard, 12th century, a great, marvelous, scandalous love affair. Abelard, cleric, which was the lowest order of priesthood. Héloïse, his pupil, and they fell madly in love. And they were lovers. And Eloise's relatives came and castrated Abelard. And so Abelard retired to a monastery, and Eloise was retired to a convent. But she wrote him letters all the time, and he wrote her letters all the time. His were quite dignified, but hers were, "Goodness, how I miss you, darling." They were absolutely wonderful, passionate, intense letters of a very intelligent, highly intelligent woman. And their love affair was simply one of the great events, one of the great events of the time. But partly because there was at this time an introduction of the idea of love. And everybody had spent more time than you could believe trying to figure out where it came from. And most people think it came from Spain, from the Arabs. But it began to be a cult of love. And it had very elaborate rules. There were certain things you could do. They would have an actual court in which somebody who had done something wrong about love, that is, he hadn't done it in the right order or whatever, was called up before the court and fined, and he had to defend himself. It was an elaborate system. And it went all through Europe. And the ideal always was adulterous love, Christian Isolde and so on. And it was always the idea of the ideal woman that the person would lay down his life for. And it's all wonderfully suggested that it was really a kind of alternate church. Was called by the people who followed in the Church of Love. But it had, what it produced was some extraordinary poetry, some of the most beautiful poetry, love poetry in the world. And also it produced the idea of love, of romantic love, actually romantic love, as having certain kinds of necessary forms. Now, this occurs at exactly the same time that the Virgin begins to be the most important divine figure. Now, she's not meant to be divine, but she is in everybody's mind. Because as the mother of Christ, she has the power of a mother over him. And the turning to the Virgin was almost certainly that part of the sense of redemption, part of the sense that the world hadn't ended and somebody had stopped it from ending. And the only person who could have stopped it was the Virgin. So that she, because she represents mercy. And the fact that the divine power was merciful and didn't end the world was the proof that it was the Virgin. So the building of the cathedral started in the middle of the 11th century. They started in a very, really, in a very tentative way, because there had not been any building since Rome. And in Charlemagne went to Ravenna and tried to make a building like it. But all the art of building was lost. And so these buildings were overbuilt in the most wonderful way. I mean, the walls would be 10 feet thick because they didn't know how thin you could make them with any safety. So everything is, in a way, was totally overbuilt. And it was relatively small. And then when the Gothic appeared, and this is sharp, when the great Gothic cathedral, the whole thing changes. And let's look at the next slide. That expectation of the end of the world was so strong that in the 900s, the book which was most copied, most illustrated all over Europe was the book of the Apocalypse, which was about the end of the world. And over here on the left, the title, that is the beginning of the end of the world. And because the angel has appeared, blowing the trumpet, and then everything starts to happen. The stars all fall on the earth. Let's look at the next two. Everybody's drowned exactly as they were killed exactly as they were in the flood. The horror of Babylon is pouring all kinds of poisons onto the world. Let's look at the next two. And there is no real person to turn to. It isn't until after the year 1000, after the whole of the 11th century, the first part, that there was any sense that you could turn to anyone. The figure of Christ is the figure of judge. He's a figure holding up the sacred book, admonishing, judging, absolutely without any kind of tenderness, any kind of mercy. The figure of Mary and the Christ child. You see, the Christ child, it looks like the same kind of judge that he is when he's grown. And Mary is behind him. But let's look at the next two. What happens is that she becomes, it's an inevitable thing. When the figure of Christ becomes a judge, and that starts in the 6th century, and becomes the judge of the last judgment, and is only seen as a very powerful and really infinitely just figure. But see, no human being has ever wanted justice for himself. We hope that our enemies get their just deserts. But all of us want and need and must have mercy. And we all really know it. Well, the only merciful figure, was the figure of Mary. And consequently, she was also wonderfully powerful, you see. But her whole attention, all of her miracles, had to do with circumventing justice. Either human justice or divine justice. One of the miracles that she performed was a man who was being hanged. She went and held his feet up so that he didn't die. And this was all because he had said one Ave Maria. So he was saved. And then the people recognized him because he didn't die, he kept on hanging there and not dying. And that, it must be a miracle. And they cut him down and he had a fine life after. And she was always doing it. She was very, very devoted to lovers. There's a story about a young girl who was in a convent, fell in love with a man, ran away from the convent with him, lived her whole life with him. He died, and she thought, well, I have no place to go except back to the convent. Maybe they'll let me be a janitoress, And she went back, and they didn't know she'd been gone. Where he had taken her place the whole time. So it was all of her miracles, literally I think all of her miracles, have to do with protecting, in a sense, naughty people, or people who were doing something that everybody else would condemn. And that she, however, had the greatest fondness and sympathy for. In fact, one person wrote a poem saying he didn't want to go to heaven because it was full of cripples and adulteresses and all kinds of things, all saved by the Virgin. Whereas the people who were in hell were within, delightful. But you can see it, she really had that, and I think some of you know the story of the juggler of Notre Dame who had nothing, he was ignorant, he had nothing that he could do, and he thought, well, I'll juggle for Our Lady, and so he went and did and died, and she came down off of the altar, she got in the statue and took him up to heaven. But it's only one of just endless stories. Part of what made the sort of coherence and the pleasure of the Middle Ages was the fact that they had endless stories. They had stories about everything, and they constantly, they knew them, they recited them, they sang them, they illustrated them. It was just a marvelously rich world. And let's look at the next two. You see, always she's holding the Christ child. Now, part of the effectiveness of the courts of love and the new attitude toward love and the Virgin representing love and mercy and tenderness was a kind of feminization of the whole society. And another thing which caused that was that almost all the men were gone. See, the men would go on a crusade, or they'd go on a pilgrimage, or they would be killed in battle, in minor battle. And so the running of the society more and more fell on women. And the woman, for instance, of the manor, and over on the right you have her walking out and telling the people what to do, you see, planting the garden. And that women had an enormous responsibility when the men were gone. They had to defend the castle. They had to run what was a huge enterprise. Castles and the houses and places of the nobility and the abbeys and the convents were all tremendous business. They had great numbers of people involved and working all the time. And it fell to the women to oversee this or actually to do it. Over here on the left you have them defending the castle. The men weren't there, they had to. And they did. And you have some women who actually become generals. They work and go into battle, sometimes with their husbands, sometimes because their husbands are killed. So let's look at the next two. Over on the left is the lover being crowned by his beloved. These are little ivory carvings. And over on the right, we have a game of chess. And games, particularly chess, were interpreted or had a meaning which had to do with the courts of love. And it is exactly at this time that the pieces in a chess set changed. There was no queen until this time. And the queen, there were 4 kings. And the queens, of course, become very powerful. The king in chess does only, very minor movements, very few things he can do. He's powerful, but he's not anywhere near as active. And the queen becomes, in a way, the most important piece, or the most active piece, the one that can make the game move. And this is simply part of this really adoration of the female aspect of the world. Let's look at the next. I'll show you some miniatures. These delight me because there are women painting the Madonna. And you see the one over on the right has a little workshop, and that's an apprentice that she has to grind her colors and prepare the panels, and in fact do all of that kind of work. And let's look at the next two. There are two women painting themselves. A wonderful idea, and it's such a nice thing to think of them that long ago, sitting in their castles painting themselves, holding up a little pan mirror, and there's this nice image. Let's look at the next one. And there's a woman who's a sculptor. She's carving and making a figure. And over on the right, a woman working in a forge. There was no, I could show you, I don't know how many women as miners, as builders, as just all kinds of things. They were able to do this, and in a way they had to do it. And it becomes a part of something which is expected and which really continues into the Renaissance period. That's what the next thing. Part of that is that there were guilds, there were societies in which people worked, and which took quite a bit to get into. And therefore, if the person who was doing it and the work was usually in his own house, then the other people in his family were also working on it. And if he died, they could continue, and did continue. So that you have a lot of work which is done by women. Now, almost no work in the Middle Ages was signed. There's occasional use of a signature, but almost none of it was signed. Because it wasn't the idea. The idea wasn't the person's greatness or his aggrandizement, but just what he made, the glory of God. And you can see the charts on the left and the floor plan. Because in the floor plan you see that terrible desire, which a really intense desire that the Middle Ages had, that things should be symmetrical and orderly, and that they should mean something, so that the body of the church looks like a crucifix. And this was intentional. And every part of it is mathematically related to every other part in a very strict, harmonious, exact way. So that this comes from a real geometry. It's not something which was just an accident. Let's look at the next two, because you can see when you look at them. On the right, you have a church of the 12th century, and on the left you have sharks in the 13th century. And the one on the right, as you can see, has absolutely no windows and would be perfectly dark if that weren't artificially lighted for photographs. And in a period of about 50 years, the whole thing has changed. And you have churches flooded in light. And great rose windows and great apse all open, all with stained glass, all simply making the interior really like a light show, because the windows, of course, change color with the different times of day, with the different type of climate, with everything. And the light from the windows fell on the stones and changed their color all the time. So it was a marvelously altering and shifting and changing light, but a very beautiful light that filled the whole church. Let's look at the next one. And that was achieved by the type of bay. They were made rectangular, and therefore they could be much larger, and by the opening out of the upper part called three-story. So that could be filled and with stained glass, and simply the entire church would become light. There's something about this which has the same quality. Let's look at the next two, of a feminine quality. There's a delicacy and a lightness actual feeling of some refinement that is, it seems more feminine than perhaps any other architecture. You can see when you have great windows, great rose windows like this, which were on the transept, marvelously brilliant, beautiful against the stone. And you can't even see most of what they're about. You have to get, they weren't meant to be seen in that sense. They weren't something made for people to see in the sense that you look at a picture. They were meant really for the Virgin. They were meant for the church. Let's look at the next picture. And there's the Virgin herself. Well, this is all the beautiful glass. One of the most beautiful of all the stained glass windows of the Virgin, which are just endless numbers. Because part of the thing which is so amazing about the Gothic period, and again it's something which happens any time that a new idea comes into fruition. And that is this sense of marvelous fecundity, that there's an enormous output of energy and an output of objects that is just astounding in any period which lacks that quality. And let's look at the next, the number of stained glass windows, of course, in the whole of France alone is just absolutely staggering. There were 80 cathedrals built in that 100-year period. All stone, and they're all enormous. You know, Chartres holds 10,000 people. And that was the population of Chartres. And that's what it held, 10,000 people. And in addition to 80 cathedrals, there were over 500 stone churches, not as big as this. So that it was just that when you think about it, you're just simply inundated. Think of the number of people it took. Think of the number of workmen it took, the artists it took, designers it took, to make this enormous outpouring of really a worship, and a worship of mercy and love, and with a great sense of kind of youthfulness, the pleasure and joy of youth. Here again, the Virgin, and over there, the Assumption of the Virgin, which was absolutely against the theology of the time. It made no difference if people believed that the Virgin should have been taken up into heaven. And so they show her being taken up into heaven. And it's over and over what their devotion to the Virgin creates, what they see, what we see. Not approved half the time. Most of the stories were not approved by the clergy at all. But they could not stop people from feeling that this must have happened. This must be what happened. Let's look at the next one. It's a visitation, and that is the mother of John the Baptist and the mother of Jesus meeting when they're both pregnant. And there have an angel sensing around the Virgin and child. It's over and over. Let's look at the next few slides. Over and over, it is the Virgin herself. And there are all kinds of other things, of course, endless other things, because everybody partook in this. This was something which everybody had a part in. Now, on the right, you have the butcher's window. They paid for that window. They commissioned it and paid for it. And you can see the man is about to strike the bull on the head. And they're hard to see, but he's got an axe raised up. And of course, the butcher has dogs, naturally, because there's so much scrap. And there's a little dog sitting, waiting for the bull to be killed and eaten. And over here, you have sculptures again. And that was given by the sculptors. The window itself was given by the sculptors. So, and they're tanners and furriers, and every trade, every craft carried this kind of adoration that made them want to be a physical part of the cathedral. Let's look at the next one. these are two doorways. One doorway has over 3,000 sculptures on it. You see what it means? It means not only that people want this, and they want it bad enough to pay for it, and they do pay for it, and they pay well for it, but they also have enough of idea about what they want. And what it turns out to be is the whole world. They saw the cathedral as if it were the whole world, as if it were the outside of the world of nature, the world of morals, the world of history, the world, every part of the world they wanted on the cathedral. And so, of course, it means endless subject matter, endless things. You could put crickets and you could put squirrels. Everything that existed in the mind of God. And if God for a moment didn't think of that thing, not only would it never have lived, but it's totally dropped out of all the previous life, as it was simply expunged from the whole world, and of course itself. So everything stayed at once in the mind of God. And the cathedral had that same urge to make, because that was what the world was, the image of the mind of God. And therefore they made the church that way, made the cathedral that way. And every part of it could be, of course, as you know, all over, places where you could never see them, where literally you cannot get to, are covered with sculpture. And with all kinds of things, funny things, obscene things, witty things, beautiful things, every imaginable thing that the human being can think of is on the cathedral. And with that, of course, does the endless carving of all of the whole thing. Each of those little things might be the seasons, it might be the virtues, it might be squirrels, it might be rabbits, it might be, you see, anything that you could think of. Whole orders of things, and individual things. Let's look at the next one. There is the coronation of the Virgin chart, because the Virgin is now in heaven, and it sits on the right hand of the Christ, and has then endless power over him. So the right hand is the hand, the powerful hand, and it is the one that indicates honor. And so the Virgin is crowned by, she's actually already crowned, and Jesus does recognize it. And then down below you have again the Assumption of Virgin. And over on there, the presentation of Christ in the temple, and visitation, all the endless stories, the stories of the Virgin, the stories of the Virgin's mother and father, the story of Jesus, the story of every single one of the apostles. There is no end to it. And then you get to the saints. And there are more saints than you could believe. You see, when you're named for a saint, you live in a town that's named for another saint, so the saints pile up on top of your head, you see, until you are literally, you have a continuous company of saints with you. And if you're in a guild, you have a saint who's also taking care of you. It's a marvelous arrangement, and one which was believed absolutely. They believed in the saints exactly as I believe in you people sitting here, exactly the same way. And if the saints didn't perform as they should, they would punish them. They would take something away from them, or turn their face to the wall. Now then, let's see what you can do. An extraordinary moment of such, in which people lived in an absolutely invisible world and an absolutely visible world. And they seem to be continually interchanging, and one just exactly as real as the other. Let's look at the next one. There's the coronation, there's Christ in majesty, and with the beasts of the apocalypse, who are also the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew's the angel, and Mark is the lion down there, John is the eagle, and the ox of Luke is the model. And the sense of hierarchy is so strong, and that they always put Matthew at the top. That is Matthew's angel at the top, and the eagle, and the lion and the ox, who are both earthbound creatures, even though one is much different in nature. They stay at the bottom. And then you see all around the figure of Christ. And then endless back, and all, and on the doors. Let's look at the next slide. It's a period of such lushness, and yet always such great difference. I mean, the things there's no sense of the things being just a form. The faces are the faces of people, and they are things which are real, actual. And even when there's something like scenes of hell, there's hell mouth and people being stuffed into it. The scene of the Last Judgment, and hell itself over on the right, and Satan sitting in it, and all of the demons doing all of the things that they always do. And of course, it's made for wonderfully lively and interesting things, whereas heaven is not nearly as interesting naturally, because people are simply standing around rejoicing that they're in heaven. And that doesn't make for the same kind of drama that being pinched with hot pincers and stuffed in the elbow by any manner of means. Always when St. Michael is weighing the souls, the devils are trying to pull it down, and the angels are trying to keep it even, keep people from being damned. But it's a line, and this is all over and over. This is on the front of the cathedral, because the cathedral was thought of as heaven. You entered it, it was heaven, and outside was the whole world, this enormous, amazing world of the exterior of the cathedral. And in order to get into it, you had to go under the Last Judgment, or you had to go under the second coming of Christ. So that it was such a sense in which you have both heaven and earth, and both right there, right where you could see them and know them. Let's look at the next. And of course, marvelously, because these were made, of course, in different parts of France, and they were made by different artists, and some of them are very skillful, and some of them are not, and some of them are marvelously graceful, and the prophet Isaiah, and he becomes something like a flame or like smoke. And over here on the left, you have a wonderful comic thing, because there's always such a sense of the reality that it becomes something comic. That's Adam and Eve hiding in the bush. And God, you see, is walking along there, saying, Adam, Adam, where art thou? And both of them, can you see them? They're hiding back under the bush on the left side. They know they don't know. Let's look at the next two. They're just endless capitals. There's Daniel in the lion's den. Look at the wonderful lions. And Daniel's just very, taking a little snooze while the lions are sitting there with their mouths drawn shut. And over here on the left, you have the three magi who were warned by an angel as they slept not to go to see Herod again, but to go back home another way. And so here they are, and they're always represented as all three sleeping in the same bed. It's one of the continuous things that all of them always have their crowns on. And they're lying there so wonderfully that the angel comes and tells them, don't do that. Let's look at the next. These things are so wonderfully different and fascinating. You could spend your whole life just looking at capitals, and much less the rest of the cathedral. And this one is such a marvelously tender and strange. This is the binding of Isaac. That is Abram and Isaac. And Isaac is, as he actually should be, a grown man when this happens. And Abram holds him by the hair, but in such a tender way. And Isaac bends really to accept this death. And the hand of the angel, you can see up there coming down, and the ram that's going to be caught in the thicket. Over on the left, we have the way the angel comes down. See, that's it. No, don't turn that one. Turn it back. That's it. See, there's the head of the ram. And the angel's just catapulting down, grabbing, see, she's grabbing the hand of Abram that's holding the knife. But it's such a, such an innovative and wonderful image, and it's absolutely unlike any other. There's no other at all that has the quality of that urgency of the angel, that you feel that she simply plunged out of heaven to stop him just in time. And yet he also is so tender about this, and I think it's accepting. Of course, Isaac was one of the prototypes of Christ in the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and everything was read in a dozen different meanings. It was just the same kind of wonderful piling up of meanings that you had piling up of angels. Everything seemed to be to signify something else. And to be united with it spiritually, even if it wasn't physically. There's a continuous sense of the interchange and the absolute density and richness of meaning. Let's look at the next. And here all of the figures of this charts where they still have a sense of being really almost part of columns. And their dignity that this gives them, and this wonderful quality of fresh, beautiful faces. But that lasts only a short time, really only about, let's look at the next slide, about 20 years. And then they begin to move out from the architecture to take their own place. But then again, there they are, endless numbers of Queen of Sheba and Judith and all of the great women who are represented in these figures, and all of the prophets and apostles, everyone. And let's look at the next historical figures. There again, the story of the Virgin, the angel of Annunciation, the visitation, and the next part is the presentation of the temple. And all of these figures have this great quality of being beyond themselves and yet absolutely themselves. It's something which they all look as though they're praying, as they are themselves absolutely, and yet beyond that, they belong to another thing, another world. There's St. George, and John the Baptist, and there Theodore was one of the great knights. But you see, they all have this look. Let's look at the next one. They all have a look of otherworldliness and this worldliness exactly at the same time. I mean, it's an extraordinary balance that was a part of the power of the 13th century, was to hold the inner life and the outer life in some kind of extraordinary balance, but only for a very brief period, because it's a very difficult thing ever to do, and to hold it any length of time is essentially, I suppose, impossible. It certainly doesn't happen. But that moment of harmony is what you feel when you see these people. Let's look at the next one. And it is people that we see. I mean, it's exactly as in Rome. We're conscious of these as actual people. This is King David over here, an unknown woman. But you see, they have such a happiness inside. There's no heavy use of expression. There's no twisting of the face. But instead there's a marvelous serenity and a marvelous feeling of that kind of balance and that kind of liberty of the self that is not going to last, can't last. But for this time and over this whole rich, extraordinary, extravagant pouring out of images, divine images, secular images, every kind, that quality of the balance, the harmony of the inner and the outer is preserved. Let's look at the next one. You know that You see, it's quite unlike the Greek. It's much closer to the Roman. But it's totally unlike the Roman. Its quality is not, never with any kind of heaviness, none of that sorrow or grief or bitterness that marks almost every Roman portrait. And you know that they're portraits. You know that people don't make up faces like this. They see them, and then they say them. Let's look at the next. They all look like one family, don't they? They all look like they're related to each other, but they're related spiritually. They're related by their common life and their common belief. And this moment of just the sheer presentation of that. Let's look at the next one. There's Isaac about to be slaughtered but not be. Let's look at the next one. And then, of course, some of them are wonderfully, always, you see, there's a little element of, because the demonic world is represented just exactly with the same kind of enthusiasm. And here are various devils seizing people. Well, of course, the hierarchy of the Middle Ages is always endangered, actually really undermined by the fact that everybody knows that people will all be judged. And that there's no way that you could possibly, because it says it over and over in the Bible, you can never possibly tell which ones are really going to go to hell. Which ones are the ones which will be damned. And it can be anybody. And on the cathedral you see bishops in hell, you see kings in hell, you see lords, you see everybody. Every order of life. And it's great, even a great democratic world in which everybody may be saved or may be damned. And there's nothing that you could do to assure that, actually. And of course, Mary constantly shows that by interfering in the injustice. And over on the right, you have the liberal arts, which were part of the character of the Virgin. She was gifted in the liberal arts because she's related to wisdom. Let's look at the next. And then the figures of Christ, which is from the very beginning of Christianity, the problem of the creation of the image of Christ is the enormous one. And it begins with an image of Apollo. And it's never really achieved, it's never really satisfying until the 13th century. And by that time the artists have, in a sense, and I think that an divine image is made up of the imagination of great numbers of people. And then it is fulfilled by a particular artist. But the severity and the seriousness and the extraordinary dignity that this figure has is one of the great achievements of the presentation of the figure of Christ. Let's look at the next one. There's another. They're all right now. See, is the angel of the Annunciation of the Virgin. Now, that looks like a totally different world, doesn't it? I mean, artistically. And yet, there's a very short time between them. It's really only maybe a generation and a half. And in that time, they learn everything that they learn. The speed of it is so amazing. That they can move from that which has great charm and is delightful, but it's not convincing to us because it doesn't really, in a sense, that it can. The art feeds on art, and there was no art for the sculptor of that time to look at. There was nothing to look at. He didn't know how to do it, so he had to do it the same way a child does, or a young person. Whereas here, there's behind it. It's not long, but it's powerful. Let's look at the next one. And between these two, these conceptions of Christ, is 100 years of sacrifice. The one on the left is the 14th century, and the one on the right is 13th century. And the one on the right still has that kind of joy and tenderness, that quality of mercy and delight. It is Christ with St. John. And the one over here on the left has sunk into despair. And the image which is used over and over in the 14th and 15th century is the image of the dead Christ, not Christ as King. What's happened in between this? What happened is the Black Death. And the whole thing that we've been talking about, the whole Gothic world, came crashing absolutely down, never to occur again. Everything that it was, all of its unity, all of its universality, all of its vision, everything is gone. First, because the people are gone. At least a half or a third of the population of the whole of Europe was killed. And in many places, the whole town would be wiped out. But the thing that was so terrifying was the sight of the place. Because it was, people would be in the radiant health, and then the next day be swollen and black and dead. It was an emphatic. And there was, people wouldn't even bury them. The whole thing became an unbelievable, right in the middle of the 14th century, right exactly in the middle. And all that had been, no more could be. And the vision of the world becomes dark. The word melancholy becomes a word which people use to describe what they're doing when they're not doing anything else. It becomes a verb. They say he was sitting melancholizing. And it's that sense of despair which is natural. And not only did the Black Death destroy half of the population, but at the same time, the popes, who were the top of society, split and spent their entire time telling all of the other, each one saying the other pope was a charlatan and a horror. And to the absolute astonishment of the Middle Ages with their trust in symbol and their sense that everything is ordered, there were 2 papal rings. Each pope had a papal ring. Well, now to us, we think, well, somebody made him another ring. It is no big thing. But to them, it was enormous. It was the fall of the whole world. Because when you have another ring, it means other people have made that, you see, and that now you have it. And that implies a whole realm of corruption and a whole realm of division. And that's exactly what happened. And then the church elected a third pope as a way to cure this. And I don't need to tell you that, but in the 15th century, the church was in a very bad state. It was part of what collapsed, part of what was brought absolutely down and destroyed, and never again, after that brief century, never again. Let's look at the next 2 slides. And look what happens to the Virgin. She becomes more and more frolicsome, more and more delightful, but less and less powerful. Look at her now in the next ones. Let's look at the next one. She's a sweet little mother, isn't she? But that is not what she was in the 13th century. She was a powerful and whimsical queen. She was the queen of heaven. And she had absolute authority and power. And now then, look at her. Let's look at the next one. She's perfectly charming still, perfectly feminine, perfectly delightful, but absolutely powerless. Let's look at the next one. And over on the right, you see she's really just a little girl. She's quite a fashionable little girl, because by this time, it's 14th century, by this time it's toward the end of it, it was fashionable to have a very high forehead. And women pull their hair out to the middle of their heads, just like people plump their eyebrows. They pull every hair out so they'd have a very, very high forehead. And so here's the Virgin. She spent a little time doing that. She's not keeping those people that were hanging from being hanged, and she's not standing in for the little convent girl. But there she is. That's it. She's just perfectly charming. There's no question of that. And perfectly fashionable. But perfectly powerful. Let's look at the next one. And look at back then when we see back what she was. Queen of Heaven. Christ like a toy in her hand. She is frightening, powerful queen. Thank you very much.